No one has ever wanted me, Clara Whitmore whispered to herself, clutching the faded letter that had summoned her to Blackwell Manor, the winter wind outside rattling the tall windows as if echoing her fear. The grand hall loomed before her, cavernous and dim, the chandelier above casting fractured light across polished oak floors, while every shadow seemed to watch her trembling steps. From the far end of the room, Duke Adrian Blackwell emerged, tall and commanding, his steel-gray eyes narrowing beneath the arch of his brow as he studied her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. And in that moment, the chatter of servants and guests fell away, leaving only the quiet pulse of tension between them. Clara's pulse raced as her gloved fingers clutched the edge of her cloak, feeling both exposed and strangely seen, the weight of every whispered insult she had endured pressing against her chest like icy chains. Adrian took a step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath his polished boots, and yet he did not speak, letting his gaze linger in a way that drew her in despite every warning she had ever heeded about men of his station. The scent of burning logs from the massive fireplace mingled with the faint perfume of candles, warm against the chill that clung to her, and as she dared a glance at him, she caught the briefest flicker of something human in his eyes, a shadow of curiosity, a trace of recognition that unsettled her more than she expected. The air between them thrummed with unspoken questions, and Clara felt the tiniest spark of hope ignite amid her fear, fragile yet insistent, as though the walls of her carefully constructed solitude were beginning to tremble. She stepped forward tentatively, each footfall measured, and the Duke's lips curved almost imperceptibly, a gesture so slight she wondered if she had imagined it, yet it lingered in her mind like a promise half-seen. The flickering candlelight caught the angles of his face, the sharpness softened by shadows, and for a heartbeat, Clara felt the impossible notion that someone of such power and mystery could look at her and see more than what everyone else had condemned. Then, the distant toll of the manor clock reminded her of the cold reality she had stepped into, of all the walls and expectations that surrounded them. Yet despite that, the tension coiled tighter, an invisible thread drawing them toward each other, and as a servant approached with a tray of glasses, Adrian's gaze did not waver from her, following her every subtle movement, every nervous tilt of her head, as though cataloging her very essence. In that silent exchange, Clara realized that this night, her life, and perhaps even her heart, were on the cusp of something irrevocable, the first step in a dance of discovery and healing, the first step toward being seen. And as she met his gaze once more, the faintest smile teasing his lips suggested that Adrian Blackwell, the most feared duke in all of Westbridge, might not look away, no matter what walls she had built around herself, leaving her breath caught, her mind spinning, and the question of what he would do next hanging in the air like the faint echo of a heartbeat in the vast hall. The winter evening deepened, wrapping Blackwell Manor in a blanket of shadowed silence, the flickering candlelight casting elongated shapes across the polished floors as Clara Whitmore navigated the hall with tentative steps, each creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing like a whisper of her own unease. She paused at the library doorway, drawn by the soft rustle of papers and the steady rhythm of Duke Adrian Blackwell's movements within, the faint scent of aged books mingling with the warmth of the hearth. His eyes lifted briefly from the ledgers before returning to their meticulous calculations, yet she could feel the weight of his attention, an invisible gravity pulling her closer even as she tried to shrink into the shadowed corner. Clara's fingers grazed the spine of a tome absent-mindedly, and the sound drew his gaze, sharp but not unkind, lingering a heartbeat longer than politeness demanded, and in that small fraction of time, she sensed a vulnerability behind his composed exterior, a hint of the man beneath the carefully constructed armor of fear and reputation. A sudden draft from the open window stirred the lace of her sleeve, and she shivered despite the fire, drawing him forward without thought, his hand brushing against hers as he adjusted the heavy curtain, an electric current of acknowledgment passing silently between them. She swallowed, steadying her voice, and dared to ask a question about a painting hung above the mantel, and though it was a trivial inquiry, his response was measured, rich with consideration, the cadence of his words striking her as deliberate and attentive, revealing layers she had not anticipated. Outside, The wind rattled against the windows, a harsh accompaniment to the quiet intimacy growing in the room. Yet neither moved toward confrontation, instead letting the tension build like a tide, rolling slowly and inexorably between them. Clara felt her pulse quicken as Adrian rose to place the ledger back upon the shelf, his presence commanding space, yet allowing for an unspoken dialogue to pass. Every glance, every subtle shift a word in their unfolding conversation. She realized then that this evening, the carefully maintained walls around her heart were beginning to erode under the gravity of his observation, under the intensity of his quiet regard. And though her mind warned of propriety and distance, her instinct urged her to linger, to absorb the rare warmth in the shadow of his stoic countenance. The clock chimed in the distance, yet its echoes seemed distant, almost irrelevant, as if the universe had narrowed to the soft amber light, the rustle of papers, and the unvoiced understanding growing between them, leaving Clara with the sense that the path ahead was uncertain but inevitably entwined with the man whose eyes had refused to look away. And as she finally dared to meet his gaze, the smallest smile curved at the edge of his lips, a hint, a promise, that what began tonight was only the opening of a story neither of them had anticipated, leaving the air thick with anticipation and the question of what might unfold next lingering like a whispered secret in the vast, candlelit manor. The following morning, Blackwell Manor was bathed in a pale, slanting light that filtered through the tall, frost-laced windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors and rich tapestries. Clara Whitmore moved cautiously along the corridor, the soft sound of her slippers against the polished stone a contrast to the crackle of the hearth that still lingered in the previous night's warmth. And as she approached the library once more, she found Duke Adrian Blackwell already there, standing before the tall shelves with a volume in his hands, his expression thoughtful yet alert, the sharp lines of his face softened by the morning light. She paused, uncertain whether to speak or retreat, but his eyes lifted, meeting hers with a calm intensity that made her heart flutter unexpectedly, a quiet acknowledgment that neither of them had yet spoken aloud. She stepped forward, carrying a small tray of tea as if it could bridge the space between them, and Adrian inclined his head slightly in silent gratitude, the simple gesture resonating more deeply than any words might have, as though a private understanding passed in the briefest moment. The steam from the teacup curled into the air, mingling with the scent of old leather and polished wood, and Clara could not help but notice the faintest relaxation in his posture, a subtle shift that suggested the barriers he had built around his emotions were beginning to yield, and for a fleeting second, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps she was not invisible to him after all. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk with a measured motion, and she seated herself, mindful of the distance, yet aware that the space between them was charged, filled with the quiet electricity of unspoken words and acknowledged presence. As he returned to the ledger, his fingers brushing the pages with careful precision, Clara's gaze lingered on his profile, the way the morning light caught the glint in his gray eyes, hinting at a depth of feeling he had yet to voice, and she felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation coiling within her. The house was still save for the occasional shifting of papers and the distant echo of servants moving about their tasks, and in that stillness, they existed in a bubble of awareness, each attuned to the other's subtle shifts, a silent dance of observation and reaction. Clara found herself daring to speak, her voice tentative yet steady, inquiring about a painting she had passed in the corridor, and Adrian's reply was deliberate, his tone measured but carrying an undercurrent of warmth, the kind that spoke not of familiarity but of consideration, and in that measured exchange, she felt the first genuine connection forming, fragile yet undeniable. Time seemed to stretch as they exchanged quiet words, punctuated by the soft ticking of a clock and the muted creak of the floorboards, a rhythm that mirrored the gradual unfolding of mutual recognition and interest. As Clara stood to refill the tray, Adrian's gaze followed her, unwavering, a subtle acknowledgment that the room, the morning, and their careful steps within it were bound together by something neither fully understood but both could not deny, leaving the air between them thick with promise and unspoken questions, the first threads of a deeper story beginning to weave themselves quietly yet insistently into the fabric of Blackwell Manor. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow across the grand hall of Blackwell Manor, the long shadows stretching and twisting across the ornate rugs as Clara Whitmore arranged the teacups on the polished mahogany table, each careful movement a quiet meditation against the tension that lingered in the room. Duke Adrian Blackwell remained at his desk, reviewing documents with meticulous attention, yet his eyes lifted occasionally, tracking her movements with a deliberate focus that sent shivers down her spine despite the warmth of the fire behind her. She placed a cup before him, their fingers brushing ever so slightly, and the brief contact sparked a subtle awareness in both of them, a silent acknowledgment of the fragile thread that had begun to connect their worlds. Clara cleared her throat softly, speaking of a minor detail in the morning's correspondence, and Adrian's response was measured, thoughtful, each word carrying an unexpected weight, a recognition of her intellect and care that made her pause, realizing that he was seeing more than just a nervous young woman performing her duties. The manor around them seemed to fade as the quiet hum of understanding filled the space, the crackle of the fireplace, the soft creak of the floorboards, and the distant chime of the clock all forming a backdrop to the intricate dance of awareness and restraint. Clara allowed herself to sit more comfortably, her back straight but her shoulders no longer tense, and as Adrian adjusted the papers in front of him, the movement was precise yet fluid, a quiet strength that commanded attention without demanding it, and she felt a deepening respect, a curious mixture of awe and intrigue. A sudden draft from the open window carried the scent of snow and pine, brushing against her cheek and stirring a memory of the winter morning when she had first arrived, and the thought of that day made her smile faintly, a moment of lightness in the otherwise solemn hall. Adrian's gaze flicked to her, noticing the small change in expression, and for a heartbeat, the sternness in his eyes softened, revealing a trace of warmth beneath the carefully maintained exterior. She dared to glance back, and in that quiet exchange, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them, each gesture and glance loaded with the weight of acknowledgment and the promise of discovery. Time seemed to slow as they continued their measured interactions, the room around them alive with the subtle music of anticipation and unvoiced emotion, and Clara realized that in the vast, echoing halls of Blackwell Manor, amid the shadows and the golden light, a delicate bond was forming, fragile yet persistent, a connection that neither could ignore, leaving the air thick with expectation and the unspoken question of what might come next, a story quietly unfolding in the space between them. As the evening shadows stretched longer across Blackwell Manor, Clara Whitmore lingered in the drawing room, her fingers tracing the delicate patterns of the embroidered rug beneath her palms, her thoughts swirling with the morning's encounters and the subtle attentions of Duke Adrian Blackwell. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm amber glow that danced along the high walls, illuminating the intricate woodwork and rich tapestries. And yet the room felt charged with an unspoken energy, a tension that neither dared to name. Adrian moved with quiet deliberation, closing the ledger he had been examining and resting his hand on the polished desk, the gesture deliberate and calm, yet carrying the weight of someone accustomed to command and observation. Clara's gaze met his across the room, and for a brief moment, the bustling manor, the echoes of footsteps in distant corridors, and the soft murmur of servants faded into insignificance, leaving only the measured breathing and the silent acknowledgment that passed between them. She shifted slightly, adjusting the folds of her dress, and noticed the faintest softening in his eyes, a hint of curiosity mingled with an unspoken question, as though he were gauging her reactions, silently inviting her to reveal more of herself. The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows that intertwined around the furniture, creating a private space within the vastness of the hall, and Clara felt a surge of awareness, realizing that in this moment, they were observers and participants in a delicate, wordless conversation. Adrian stepped closer, the movement subtle but deliberate, and his presence filled the space with a quiet gravity that made Clara's heart quicken, a combination of anticipation and caution weaving through her thoughts. She dared to place a teacup on the side table near him, their hands brushing ever so slightly, sending a small, unspoken signal of acknowledgement and awareness, the contact fleeting yet charged, a spark in the muted evening light. for a heartbeat. They simply observed one another, each weighing the unspoken and savoring the tension that hovered like mist around them. The room heavy with the intimacy of proximity, yet tempered by restraint and propriety. Clara found herself daring to speak, offering a comment on the artwork adorning the wall, and Adrian's measured response revealed a keen attentiveness, a recognition of her perception and thought. And in that quiet exchange, the distance between them seemed to narrow, each acknowledging the presence and significance of the other without words. Time moved almost imperceptibly, the manor's ancient walls echoing with the soft hum of domestic activity. Yet within the drawing room, a different rhythm prevailed, one of subtle understanding, mutual recognition, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of something fragile yet inevitable. As Clara straightened, meeting Adrian's gaze once more, the faintest hint of a smile played on his lips, a suggestion of openness and invitation, leaving the evening suspended on the cusp of discovery, the quiet promise of connection, and the question of what next would come, lingering like the scent of the fire and the soft glow of the candles in the shadowed room. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Blackwell Manor, casting a warm glow over the rich furnishings and gilded frames that lined the walls, and Clara Whitmore stood quietly near the window, her hands folded in front of her, feeling the subtle weight of anticipation as Duke Adrian Blackwell moved methodically across the room, attending to his papers yet glancing up at intervals, his gray eyes meeting hers with a steady, piercing intensity that made her pulse quicken. The air was filled with the faint scent of polished wood and the lingering warmth from the hearth, and though the manor was vast and echoed with the distant movement of servants, the space between them seemed suspended in a private stillness, charged with the tension of unspoken thoughts and careful observation. Clara took a hesitant step forward, her gaze tracing the lines of his face as the firelight highlighted the sharp angles softened by shadows, and she noticed for the first time a subtle warmth in the depth of his eyes, a flicker of curiosity, and perhaps recognition that unsettled her in a way she could not name. Adrian straightened from the desk, the movement precise and deliberate, yet there was a fluidity in his presence that spoke of restrained attention, and as he adjusted a chair nearby, Clara felt a quiet pull, the awareness of his proximity igniting a delicate thrill of consciousness within her. The soft rustle of her skirts as she shifted drew his eyes once again, and for a brief moment, they held each other in silent measurement, the weight of the unspoken thick between them, yet filled with possibility. Clara spoke then, her voice soft yet deliberate, commenting on the arrangement of the books along the shelf, and Adrian's reply was careful, measured, yet carried a warmth beneath the formal cadence, the subtle recognition of her thoughtfulness and presence striking her with unexpected clarity. The room seemed to breathe with them. The flicker of candlelight on the polished surfaces, the muted creak of the floorboards, and the distant tick of the manor clock creating a rhythm that matched the quiet acceleration of their mutual awareness. She dared to move closer to place a note upon his desk, and their fingers brushed lightly, a fleeting, electrifying contact that spoke volumes in the absence of words, and Adrian's gaze lingered, acknowledging the significance without breaking the delicate tension. Clara felt her heart quicken, the awareness of being seen, understood, and regarded in a way she had never experienced before washing over her, and the quiet intensity of the moment held her suspended, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the subtle unfolding of recognition and connection. They stood together in measured proximity, each attuned to the other's smallest gestures, each inhalation and glance a thread weaving an intricate, invisible pattern of understanding, curiosity, and tentative trust, leaving the space between them alive with anticipation, suspended expectation, and the quiet promise of discovery yet to unfold in the shadowed, candlelit halls of Blackwell Manor. The evening deepened, and Blackwell Manor was bathed in a soft twilight that filtered through the tall, frost-laced windows, the amber glow of candles reflecting in the polished surfaces and gilded frames, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Clara Whitmore moved carefully along the edge of the rug, her fingers brushing the fabric as if seeking reassurance in its familiar texture, while Duke Adrian Blackwell stood near the fireplace, his posture composed yet his gaze following her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, every measured glance a silent acknowledgment of her presence and worth. The room seemed suspended, alive with the quiet hum of anticipation, the soft crackle of the fire punctuating the otherwise still air, and Clara could feel the weight of observation, the sense that every subtle motion, every tilt of her head, was noted with a precision that both unnerved and fascinated her. She set a small book down upon the table, the sound of it settling on the polished wood resonating softly, and Adrian's eyes lifted, locking onto hers with a depth that made her breath catch, the unspoken recognition between them filling the space with a charged energy. A gentle draft from the open window stirred the folds of her dress, and she shivered slightly, the chill countered by the warmth radiating from the hearth and the subtle awareness of his nearness, an invisible thread weaving them together in the quiet intimacy of proximity. Adrian adjusted a chair, the movement deliberate and fluid, and Clara noted the faintest softening at the corners of his eyes, a hint of curiosity mingled with unvoiced acknowledgment, and she allowed herself a small smile, careful yet genuine, feeling the first fragile sense of being seen as she truly was. The distant echo of servants moving about the manor faded into the background, leaving only the private rhythm of their shared space, each gesture, each shift in posture carrying weight and meaning, a conversation conducted without words, rich in subtlety and layered with intent. Clara dared to speak, commenting lightly on the arrangement of the books and portraits, and Adrian responded with measured, thoughtful words, his voice steady, yet carrying an undercurrent of warmth and attentiveness, a recognition of her insight that made her heart lift. The flickering candlelight traced shadows along his profile, emphasizing the sharp planes softened by the dim glow, and for a moment, Clara felt a quiet thrill, the awareness that the man before her was not merely observing but considering, calculating, and quietly valuing her presence. Each moment stretched, elongated by the gentle cadence of their interaction, the quiet punctuated by the subtle sounds of the manor, creating a private space of attention and anticipation, and Clara sensed the fragile beginnings of trust, the careful formation of a bond tempered by restraint, mutual respect, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of something profound yet unspoken, leaving the air thick with expectation, connection, and the tantalizing hint of discovery yet to come. The night settled over Blackwell Manor like a soft, enveloping cloak, the glow from the fireplace casting flickering light across the tall windows and polished floors, the shadows stretching long and delicate along the tapestries and carved woodwork. Clara Whitmore lingered near the window, her gaze drifting over the snow-covered gardens beyond, the cold glass pressing lightly against her fingertips as her mind traced the hours of the day, the careful attention and quiet presence of Duke Adrian Blackwell still vivid in her thoughts. The room was hushed, the distant murmur of servants moving quietly through the halls barely audible, leaving the drawing room suspended in a tranquil yet charged atmosphere where every glance and subtle movement carried weight. Adrian stood near the hearth, the warm glow illuminating the planes of his face, softening the sharp angles with light and shadow, and his eyes met hers across the room, steady and contemplative, holding a depth that drew her in despite her careful reserve. She took a tentative step closer, her movements deliberate, and the faint rustle of her dress against the rug seemed to echo in the stillness, a sound amplified by the unspoken awareness between them, the invisible tension that had grown over the hours settling into something both fragile and compelling. The fire flickered, casting dancing patterns on the walls, and Clara felt a small warmth seep into her chest, a quiet reassurance amidst the uncertainty and the vastness of the manor, while Adrian adjusted the placement of a nearby chair with precise, measured motions, every gesture speaking of the control he maintained and the subtle invitation that accompanied it. She spoke softly then, her voice carrying a careful curiosity as she remarked on the arrangement of the furniture and the way the light fell across the room, and Adrian's response was equally measured, thoughtful, his tone carrying a muted warmth, an acknowledgment of her perception and a reflection of his growing interest. The air between them seemed charged, filled with anticipation and the quiet rhythm of mutual observation, the soft crackle of the fire punctuating the silence, each flicker of flame mirroring the subtle shifts in attention and the delicate unfolding of awareness and connection. Clara dared to step slightly nearer, placing a small hand on the edge of the table, and Adrian's gaze followed her with an intensity that made her pulse catch, a careful acknowledgment of proximity and presence without encroaching, as though the space they shared had been drawn with invisible lines, delicate and precise. For a long, suspended moment, they simply observed one another, the room itself seeming to pause, attuned to the silent communication that passed in glances, gestures, and the subtle cadence of breaths, and Clara realized with a growing sense of anticipation that the quiet bond forming in these hours, tempered by restraint and mutual awareness, was poised to deepen, leaving the night filled with unspoken promise, suspended questions, and the delicate, unfolding possibility of connection in the candlelit, shadowed expanse of Blackwell Manor. The first snow of the season had begun to fall outside Blackwell Manor, drifting silently against the tall windows and settling on the stone terraces, creating a pristine layer of white that reflected the flickering candlelight within the drawing room. Clara Whitmore stood near the tall window, her breath forming faint clouds against the cold glass, and watched the flakes tumble gracefully, her mind lingering on the day's small exchanges with Duke Adrian Blackwell. The manor was quiet, the distant murmur of the staff barely audible, leaving a hushed space where the fire's warmth and the golden light of the lamps created a cocoon of intimate stillness. Adrian moved deliberately across the room, placing a small stack of correspondence on his desk, and then paused, his gaze drifting toward Clara, following the subtle movements of her hands as they traced the frost-lined panes. The intensity in his gray eyes was palpable, yet tempered with a quiet curiosity that made her pulse accelerate, a mixture of anticipation and caution weaving through her thoughts. Clara took a tentative step back, adjusting the folds of her gown, but the subtle pull of attention from Adrian made her linger, each step measured, each glance laden with unspoken understanding. The room seemed to breathe with them, the flickering shadows dancing on the walls and furniture, the faint creak of the floorboards accentuating the fragile tension that filled the space. A soft draft stirred the candle flames, their light flickering across Adrian's profile, highlighting the strength and subtle vulnerability coexisting in his expression. And Clara felt an unexpected surge of awareness, realizing that he saw more than the careful composure she maintained. He observed the quiet determination and the suppressed hopes that she herself had struggled to acknowledge. She dared to speak, her voice a delicate thread in the warm hush of the room, remarking on the beauty of the winter scene outside, and Adrian responded with measured warmth, the inflection of his voice conveying both attentiveness and a subtle, personal acknowledgment that resonated deeply. The fire crackled softly, each pop a punctuation in the otherwise silent dialogue, and Clara noticed the faintest shift in his stance, a softening that suggested the walls around him, carefully constructed over years of command and solitude, were yielding to the quiet presence she embodied. Time seemed to stretch and fold in the drawing room, each movement, glance, and breath weighted with significance, and in that suspended stillness, Clara realized that a fragile thread of trust and recognition had been established, delicate yet insistent, weaving between them in the golden light. Adrian took a slow, deliberate step closer, and though the space between them remained, the intensity of attention, the careful observation, and the subtle acknowledgement created a private rhythm, a silent understanding forming in the heart of Blackwell Manor, leaving both of them poised on the brink of discovery, the first winter snow outside a mirror to the slow, inevitable unfolding of connection and the quiet promise of the moments yet to come. The late evening shadows deepened in Blackwell Manor, the tall windows catching the silver light of the rising moon and scattering it across the polished floors and richly embroidered tapestries, the quiet stillness of the house creating a private sphere where Clara Whitmore stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped lightly before her, absorbing the warmth and the faint scent of burning wood. Duke Adrian Blackwell remained seated at his desk, reviewing a few papers with careful precision, yet his gaze lifted intermittently, drawn to Clara with an intensity that made the air between them hum with anticipation. She took a slow, deliberate step closer, her dress rustling softly against the rug, and for a moment, The distance between them seemed charged with unspoken acknowledgment, every subtle movement conveying more than words ever could. The flickering candlelight traced the angles of Adrian's face, softening the sharp planes with shadows that danced across his expression, revealing a quiet curiosity that mirrored her own growing awareness of his attention. Clara's fingers hovered near a small stack of letters on the desk, and the faintest contact of her sleeve against the edge drew his eyes, lingering on her with a subtle, measured acknowledgment that made her pulse accelerate. The soft draft from the slightly ajar window stirred the flames of the candles, the shifting light reflecting in Adrian's gray eyes, a glimmer of warmth and recognition that unsettled her and yet comforted her in equal measure. She dared to speak, her voice carrying softly across the space, inquiring about a minor detail in the correspondence, and his response was deliberate, thoughtful, and tinged with quiet warmth, a recognition of her presence and insight that made the room feel suspended in a delicate, shared understanding. The fire crackled, punctuating the silence with its gentle, rhythmic pops, and Clara felt the subtle tension of anticipation building between them, each aware of the other's careful attentiveness, the private, silent dialogue growing with every glance, every shift of posture, every measured breath. Adrian rose slowly, moving to adjust a book on the nearby shelf, and Clara's eyes followed the motion, noting the deliberate care in his movements, the underlying ease that belied the commanding presence he maintained, and the quiet consideration he afforded her in every subtle gesture. Time seemed to stretch, each moment elongated and filled with the gentle rhythm of observation and awareness, and Clara realized that the walls she had built around herself were gradually softening, the careful reserve giving way to tentative trust and burgeoning understanding. The air between them pulsed with the rhythm of unspoken acknowledgment, the shared space alive with the nascent connection, the unvoiced promise of attention and recognition, leaving both Clara and Adrian poised on the edge of discovery, the candlelight reflecting in their eyes, and the quiet anticipation of what the next hour might reveal lingering like a fragile thread across the room. The manor had settled into a hushed calm, the moonlight spilling through the frost-lined windows, creating a lattice of silver across the polished floors and rich tapestries. And Clara Whitmore stood near the hearth, her hands lightly clasped, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire as her thoughts wandered to the steady, deliberate presence of Duke Adrian Blackwell. He moved with quiet authority across the room, his eyes occasionally lifting from the documents he had been examining to regard her with a depth that made her chest tighten and her pulse quicken, the intensity in his gaze tempered by a subtle warmth that suggested a recognition she had not expected. Clara adjusted her stance, feeling the weight of attention directed upon her in a way that was both unsettling and reassuring, the silent acknowledgment between them carrying a gravity that seemed to slow the passage of time. The faint draft from the window stirred the flickering candlelight, casting moving shadows across Adrian's profile, and she noticed the smallest shifts in his expression, the brief softening of his brow and the slight relaxation of his shoulders, signals that communicated more than words ever could. She took a careful step closer, her dress rustling softly across the rug, and placed a small note on the desk, her fingers brushing the edge lightly, the contact brief yet charged, drawing a quiet acknowledgment in the form of a lingering gaze that made her heart flutter. The room seemed suspended, alive with a rhythm defined by subtle glances, soft exhalations, and the gentle crackle of the fire, and Clara felt an awareness building, the sense that this shared space had become a stage for delicate observations and unspoken dialogue. Adrian shifted slightly, his movements controlled yet fluid, drawing the eye with the weight of quiet authority, and when he finally spoke, his voice was deliberate, measured, carrying a note of warmth and consideration that drew Clara in, making her realize that he valued her presence and insight in a manner far more personal than mere etiquette demanded. She responded, her voice soft yet confident, commenting on a detail she had noticed in the room, and his reply mirrored her attentiveness, thoughtful and rich with subtle recognition, deepening the unspoken understanding between them. The firelight danced across their figures, accentuating the interplay of shadows and light, and Clara felt the fragile beginnings of trust, a tentative thread weaving them together in a tapestry of attention, mutual awareness, and restrained emotion. Each heartbeat seemed amplified in the stillness, every movement and glance a note in a silent conversation. And as they continued in this delicate rhythm, the manor around them faded, leaving only the quiet promise of connection, the anticipation of discovery, and the suspended question of how far this emerging bond might grow. Held in the gentle, flickering light of Blackwell Manor. The moonlight filtered softly through the tall windows of Blackwell Manor, casting silver patterns across the polished floors and rich tapestries. And Clara Whitmore remained near the hearth, her hands lightly resting on the edge of the mantel as she watched the shadows dance and flicker with the glow of the fire. Duke Adrian Blackwell moved with deliberate grace across the room, his eyes lifting occasionally from the ledger he had been reviewing to regard her, the intensity in his gray gaze steady, yet softened by a trace of warmth that made her heart flutter. She stepped slightly closer, the rustle of her skirts muted against the rug, and the subtle movement drew his attention, a quiet acknowledgment passing in the gentle exchange of glances that spoke more than words could convey. The room seemed suspended in a delicate balance, the soft crackle of the fire punctuating the silence as they navigated the shared space, each aware of the other's presence and the quiet, unspoken understanding that was weaving itself between them. Clara allowed her eyes to linger on the slight curve of his lips, the controlled strength in his stance, and the faintest trace of consideration in his expression, realizing that the walls around his heart were beginning to yield to the quiet constancy of her presence. Adrian adjusted a chair with deliberate precision, the movement fluid and calm, and Clara felt a subtle shiver of anticipation, the awareness of proximity and unspoken attention heightening her senses and drawing her further into the rhythm of their interaction. She dared to speak, her voice soft yet deliberate, commenting on the arrangement of the desk and the careful placement of books, and his response was measured, thoughtful, imbued with a muted warmth that suggested appreciation and acknowledgement, the subtle interplay of their words and glances creating a private cadence of observation and connection. The faint draft from the slightly open window stirred the flames of the candles, the shifting light reflecting in Adrian's eyes and highlighting the depth of consideration he directed toward her, and Clara felt the fragile beginnings of trust and recognition, delicate yet insistent, forming a thread between them. Time seemed to slow as the quiet exchange continued, each glance, each gesture laden with significance, the stillness of the manor amplifying the intimacy of the unspoken dialogue. Clara noticed the subtle relaxation in Adrian's posture, the way his shoulders softened and his gaze lingered with deliberate intent, and she allowed herself a small, tentative smile, acknowledging the quiet understanding that had developed. The room around them seemed to fade, leaving only the private rhythm of mutual awareness, the gentle rise and fall of their breaths, and the suspended anticipation of what might unfold next, the candlelight reflecting off polished surfaces and warming the space with the promise of connection, leaving Clara and Adrian poised on the cusp of discovery, their shared presence in the quiet, shadowed manor a delicate and unfolding story of recognition, trust, and the quiet potential of something deeper to come. The night had deepened over Blackwell Manor, the soft glow of the moon filtering through frost-kissed windows and casting silvered light across the polished floors and ornate furnishings, and Clara Whitmore remained near the hearth, her hands resting lightly on the edge, feeling the warmth and the subtle rhythm of the fire as it crackled and whispered in the quiet room. Duke Adrian Blackwell stood across the room, moving with deliberate grace as he adjusted a small stack of papers on his desk, yet his gaze continually returned to her, steady and attentive, filled with a quiet intensity that made the space between them pulse with anticipation and unspoken understanding. Clara took a careful step closer, her dress rustling softly against the rug, and the subtle motion drew his attention, a lingering acknowledgment passing between them that conveyed far more than words could capture. The flickering candlelight highlighted the planes of his face, the shadows softening the sharp lines and revealing a depth of emotion that Clara had not dared to imagine, a quiet warmth beneath the careful composure he maintained. She placed a small envelope on the desk, her fingers brushing the edge lightly, and Adrian's eyes followed the motion, holding hers with a steady, deliberate gaze that made her chest tighten with both excitement and apprehension. The room seemed to hold its breath, alive with the rhythm of quiet glances, subtle gestures, and the shared awareness that each carried its own weight of meaning, a delicate and intricate conversation conducted without words. A gentle draft stirred the flames, casting moving shadows that danced across the room, and Clara felt the fragile beginnings of trust and understanding forming a bond between them, delicate yet undeniable. Adrian's hand moved slightly, adjusting a chair with precision, and Clara noticed the subtle relaxation in his posture, a softening that spoke of his attention and the consideration he offered to her presence. The fire crackled, the sound punctuating the silence like a measured heartbeat, and Clara dared to speak, her voice soft but deliberate, commenting on the way the moonlight fell across the room and the elegance of the manor in its quiet stillness. And Adrian's reply was equally measured, thoughtful, imbued with a subtle warmth that acknowledged her perception and insight, deepening the silent conversation that stretched between them. Time seemed suspended, each movement and glance weighted with meaning, the air alive with anticipation, mutual recognition, and the delicate rhythm of unspoken communication, and Clara realized with a fluttering awareness that the walls she had built around herself were softening under the quiet, steady attention of the man before her. The space between them became charged with possibility, every subtle motion and gaze weaving a thread of connection that neither could ignore, the room itself fading into the background as the private rhythm of acknowledgment and attentiveness carried them toward an unspoken understanding. The moonlight, the flickering fire, the quiet of the manor, and the measured attention between them combined to create a moment suspended in time, delicate, profound, and alive with the promise of what might unfold, leaving both Clara Whitmore and Duke Adrian Blackwell poised on the cusp of discovery, the quiet intimacy of the night shaping the first, tender threads of a bond that would slowly, inevitably deepen.